An intense debate is underway over the benefits and drawbacks of human microchips. They're already used to identify ranch animals and pets.
You see, we're always the test bed of many of these countries and nations, and I'm tired of these African leaders who think that everybody's their friend, that they can go ahead and have confidence that they're out for the good of the people.
We're taking things that are, genetically modified organisms, and we're injecting them in little kids' arms. We just shoot them right into the vein.
Now, let me just put it blatantly to you. The program targets the birth of new babies. So once you have your baby, before your baby leaves the hospital, you no longer get a paper birth certificate, but then you get a digital one that is somehow implanted somewhere on somebody's body.
And it would appear that Bill Gates has found a soft spot in one nation in Africa, Kenya. This is a tragedy about to befall Africa. A brother, Go Black to Africa, very recently made a video about it, and I want us to look at that video. Share your thoughts on that video, but as well, I'm going to give a commentary on that video and just the general context of the nation Kenya regarding this matter that is likely to violate very fundamental human rights. Check out the video and let's have a candid discussion. Are we going to be caught napping again?
Peace and blessing to all my brothers and sisters that are out there in the struggle, but yet trying to overcome and try to advance into a life that is beyond those who are trying to hold you back. Listen to this right here. You know, Kenya is coming out with a digital ID program. That's right, something as crazy as that, because Bill Gates is the one who's behind it and backing it. Check this video out and I'll be back.
Now, it even gets worse. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is continuing its global push to support its so-called government-backed digital ID programs, and this time setting its sight on Kenya, where it will advise the government on that country's Maisha Namba digital ID initiative that is currently under development. So, according to a Kenyan news agency, Gates' role is assisting the Kenyan government in its development, and the rollout of Maisha Namba was announced after a recent series of the closed-door meetings with Kenyan President William Ruto. According to Biometric Update, Maisha Namba is supposedly expected to address different challenges, such as identifying and authenticating citizens, safeguarding primary registration documents such as birth certificates and national identity cards, and improving the management of the social programs and government operations. The project has been met with skepticism in some parts of the country. Rights groups have also been expressing concern over the possibility of discrimination and the erosion of privacy. But listen, I just told you in a very nice way. Now let me just put it blatantly to you. The program targets the birth of new babies. So once you have your baby, before your baby leaves the hospital, you no longer get a paper birth certificate, but then you get a digital one that is somehow implanted somewhere on somebody's body. Think about that, but have a listen to this.
The digital ID, which has been a big problem to us for a very long time, is now on a testing mode for the next 2 months. I have been assured by all the stakeholders, led by the ministries concerned, that by December, we will be able to launch digital ID, where every Kenyan don't have to carry any paper, plastic or otherwise, as an ID, that they should be able to be identified digitally using their iris or their fingerprints, and we can transact without the necessity of people struggling to identify who they are.
Kenya is in serious trouble. Now, for you to accept this, that means you're going to be completely surveilled and controlled. Think about it. So they have targeted the new babies, of course, even the ordinary citizens, the grown-ups, the young ones, the teenagers, and even the elderly ones will receive this digital ID. But they will then create a new generation where they'll be completely under this digital ID and they have no choice.
What do you think? Let me say this right here. Let me put it blatantly or bluntly. You know, people say, well, what's the big deal, Go Black? I mean, hey, it's a digital ID. People don't have IDs. They're antiquated when it comes to their so-called technology and just a quick way of identifying people. Au contraire, brothers and sisters. You see, I have an advantage than most people do because I have the so-called a mindset. Because I was in damn Erica, put the D in front of America, capitalize the E, damn Erica, for majority of my life. I've served 20 years in the military, served in the intelligence and other commands that were there in the military. And I understand the way that they think. Yes, that's right. So when you talk about anytime a Western world wants to do anything with black folks, you know it's something that they're trying to advance for their own common good, not yours. So what is it? Well, we know that he says, the President Ruto says in Kenya, oh, you know, it'd be Irish, you know, or fingerprints identification. Well, yes, that sounds innocent as much as we may believe. Of course, we have to use fingerprints, you know, when we have to get visas coming into other countries. And some of you all who work in high security places may even have to use your eyes to enter in. But what is the downfall or the cons behind the very thing that you might think is so innocent? Well, Bill Gates said they shoot an identity ID within the baby. When you really think about it, putting a chip in someone, we know is an identity that you just can't remove. It's there, it will always be there. But what if you decide that you just don't want to be identified? Matter of fact, what goes on that identification? What is on there that would be so interesting that Bill Gates and others would want to retrieve if something happens to you? Let me give you a scenario. Let's just say, because there are those out there who've already made mention that the melanin in our skin is highly desirable for the sake of many of them maintaining a youth. But let's go to the next place of this. You know, I had to do some research and find out what is the child's birth rate per year in Kenya. To my amazement, it's 1.2 million children born per year. Now you had to look up the so-called neonatal mortality rate, or the children that die. It's 3.36%. Now you might say, oh, 3% of baby deaths out of 1.2 million? That doesn't seem like a lot anyway. Oh, yes, it is. That's 40,300 and something children that die a year, and that's just Kenya. Can you imagine if on this ID that it has, of course, the genetic or the DNA genetic code for each individual baby? Of course, we know they're going to have the blood type. We're going to have all the different types of where many people who are going to want to have so-called, you know, your organs, transplants and things, which is high on the scale for sales around the world, would be a great idea when you don't have to retrieve paperwork and finding out what is this baby's makeup. And so the baby could easily be sold when you go ahead and quickly identify by bloop, hitting the so-called barcode on that child, and then turn around and cast it around the world of what is for sale. You know, we already know that the evil exists around this world. And we know the Western worlds have run tests on many of Africans, hence HIV that has been spread throughout the continent of Africa by those who had their own evil agendas and trying to deplete the population in Africa. I don't know when they're going to wake up. We don't die, we multiply. But they also in America have done programs, St. Louis, Missouri, that they drove around in 1973, spraying in the communities, trying to find out. St. Louis in 1973, where they drove around and sprayed toxin aluminants to see whether or not what the effects would be upon a black people for the military's so-called advancements in biological warfare, or the Tuskegee Airmen, where these black men were suffering with syphilis and they had the so-called cure, and then they just used them as lab rats to follow along for 20, 30, 40 years to see what the effects are, only for their own selfish gain. Or when you talk about when it was the drugs, whether it was the heroin, whether it was other psychedelic drugs that they have given to prisoners. We saw that there was a documentary done of black people that were in the prisons, that they had made promises that if they go ahead through these so-called tests, they could benefit. And only to find out years later, these tests they put them under basically caused them psychotic. Many died early on. You see, we're always the test bed of many of these countries and nations, and I'm tired of these African leaders who think that everybody's their friend, that they can go ahead and have confidence that they're out for the good of the people. You see, Africa, y'all need us who come from the Western world, because apparently, somehow, some way, many of you all are fooled. And President Ruto, I'm surprised at you. But you did say it in your statement, stakeholders. You see, this is all about money, family. This is all about greed. Because everybody stands the chance to make money except for those poor children who will be inoculated with daggone a chip or some identification, so that then if something happens while they're through their infancy stage, their adolescent stage, they can just go ahead and find the information and then sell them off. Now you say that I'm crazy. Check the history of these evil people who go around the world making billions of dollars off the backs of us.
Listening to the president make this pronouncement, talk about the route that Kenya is going to take, and his newfound friend, Bill Gates, one cannot fail to read more insidious motives. We've got to be honest about this, because it would appear that this decision has been made unilaterally by the head of state, by the government of the day. The average Kenyan on the streets will not, shall not embrace the idea to have their babies implanted with chips. In the West, for example, perhaps Sweden is one country that would be regarded as the early adopters of this technology. But you can honestly see how Sweden, in that sense, are adopting their own technology, using it within their own systems. For Africa, and for Kenya specifically, this is an imported technology that is being imposed on the masses. Why won't African countries have their own tech if really we must adopt this technology? Why won't African countries lead their own charge, have their own technology, and have a conversation with their citizens to see whether this is a direction they would want to go? Because this is a new area. This is an uncharted water. There's a risk factor to it. There's the whole concept of human autonomy, someone's own individuality, independence, and right to privacy. That data, how will it be handled? And the advancement of science is such that the information that would likely be contained in these chips can be as wide and as varied as DNA data, medical history, your traveling. So essentially, beyond what we have in the streets, such as the CCTV cameras that constantly surveil us for security, and we get that. We are now experiencing an era where somebody is going to be in too much control that the individual as we know them today may become something else. And should we not really have the right to retain our individuality, to retain our privacy, our data, our information, and use it only on a need basis? Science, to this extent, of these chips makes sense if it is applied on extreme scenarios, that perhaps an individual has got a dire situation, was involved in an accident, lost the use of limbs. Therefore, opening a door can be a problem. So a chip on your arm can help you, can aid you maneuver through the streets, through building, and indeed even for chronic health problems. Diabetes, for example, sugar's running low. You've dropped, you've collapsed in the streets. But with that kind of technology, help can come quickly. But we all know that in Africa, we are still dealing with very basic problems, such as a simple issue like the access to tap water, running tap water in homes, basic healthcare in many of rural Africa, even within urban centers. So what is this zeal to adopt technology at this level when there are still solutions that can work?
Remember that
And really, if that technology has got to be adopted, why won't a nation have a conversation? By extension, even a referendum, so that citizens can decide for themselves that this is the way we want to go. In truth, those who have led with technology have used it to their advantage. And that is what African leadership is not realizing. Instead of creating their own technology, working with their youth, a good majority young, intelligent, but instead we are having brain drain to the West, and our children are not returning home to develop the continent, to develop tech, to create solutions that are homegrown, that work for Africa. This is a tragedy, and these are the truths that we must confront. Go Black, in his own piece, is talking about the same. But we must extend it and say that the conversation has got to come from the general public. It cannot be that Africa, that was inherited after we pushed away the colonial powers, then becomes a nation, nations for select few who believe in self-aggrandizement, robbing of African coffers, building wealth for their own children, their own families, at whatever cost. Because in reality, that is what is happening today. And the rush to embrace tech, to bring anything to the continent that does not involve Africa's youth, has got to be treated as suspect and with the disdain it deserves. Africa, we lost our brothers and sisters to the West using gunpowder. Let us not lose our technology, our gene resources, because the push to have Africa relinquish some of these resources has been extended as far as into agriculture. That Kenya today has embraced new laws to control the farming processes, something that feels a lot like the medieval Western countries where the landlords were holding all the property and the masses worked as peasants for them, and they retained all the loot, all the harvest, only to give a sprinkling or crumbs to the rest of the population. And you remember, most of Europe was run by kingdoms, monarchies. Eventually, the oppression that happened in Europe resulted in the mass movement of populations from the West into America. So these were subjugated people who ended up founding America. The same thing is happening in Africa now. The elite of Africa are exploiting the populations. So to then think that you own these countries just because you have become presidents is a fallacy. and a tragedy. So Africa will have to fight this to the hilt. The more we bring in terms of knowledge will help us protect ourselves and shield ourselves from losing our identity, losing our privacy, and losing our autonomy and individuality as human beings. If Africa is to embrace technology, if Kenyans are to embrace technology, they ought to embrace that technology in their own terms and by their own means, not through resources that have been created elsewhere and imposed on them. That is exactly what happened during the Berlin Conference, when Africa was chopped up like meat on a butcher's table and dished out to different foreign powers. And we see the consequences of that in what is happening in Congo today. So Black Africa, whether you are in Australia, whether you are in the Caribbean, in the US, in Britain, wherever you are, and certainly on the continent of Africa, this is a call to you, not just Kenyans, that we've got to wake up and realize that technology, and especially in this time of AI, we stand to lose through the zeal of some of our leaders and through the zeal of tech billionaires whose interest really in Africa is unclear, and especially whose interest on African children has got to be treated as something else other than goodwill for Africa. I hope you are Afrocentric enough to understand this message. So kindly like, share, and subscribe, and help us build a channel, help us create the tribe of Africa that can represent its children across the world. Kindly check out the rest of our content. This is definitely Afrocentric. Many thanks, and we'll see you again in the next one. Bye-bye.